The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over Marion Square in Charleston, South Carolina. What should have been a tranquil scene of families and tourists strolling through the park was replaced by a sea of protesters holding signs and chanting slogans. The air buzzed with palpable tension as the crowd grew louder, their voices a mixture of anger, frustration, and despair. Many of the protesters were there to voice their concerns about various political and social issues: income inequality, climate change, and systemic injustice. For most, the protest was not initially about Barron Trump. The gathering had been peaceful at first, with impassioned speeches echoing through the square. But when word spread that Barron Trump would be attending a private charity reception at a nearby hotel, the focus shifted. His arrival became a lightning rod for their frustrations. A commotion rippled through the crowd as a sleek black SUV pulled up near the hotel's entrance. The protesters surged toward the police barricades, their chants intensifying to a single, thunderous cry, "Shame! Shame!" Barron stepped out of the car, his tall frame and composed demeanor belying his young age. Dressed in a simple suit, he carried himself with an unexpected calmness, ignoring the jeers and insults hurled at him. The police officers holding the line between the protesters and the hotel exchanged uneasy glances. The barricades were holding for now, but the crowd seemed to grow more restless with each passing second. Some protesters pushed forward, their signs shaking violently in the air. Barron paused briefly as if to take in the scene, then walked toward the hotel entrance without acknowledging the hostility around him. His composed demeanor only seemed to enrage the protesters further, their chants reaching a fever pitch. Inside the hotel, Barron disappeared from view, leaving the crowd outside to seethe in their collective anger. The tension in the square was electric, ready to spark into something uncontrollable. The officers braced themselves, scanning the crowd for any signs of escalation. But just as the chants reached their loudest, a distant sound began to grow, a low, steady rumble that cut through the noise like a heartbeat. The rumble grew louder, a thunderous cadence that made the ground beneath the square vibrate faintly. Heads turned toward the sound as it approached, a ripple of confusion spreading through the protesters. The chants faltered, replaced by murmurs of uncertainty. At the far end of the square, a procession of motorcycles emerged, their chrome gleaming under the setting sun. The bikers rode in a disciplined formation, their movements precise and deliberate. Large American flags fluttered from the backs of several bikes, their vibrant colors contrasting starkly with the dark leather vests worn by the riders. The motorcycles came to a slow, synchronized stop near the police barricades. Engines idled, the low growl of machinery filling the air. The bikers dismounted in unison, their boots hitting the pavement with a purposeful weight. They moved as a unit, their presence commanding attention. Leading the group was a man in his early 50s, his broad shoulders and rugged features giving him an air of authority. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to diffusing tense situations. Dressed in a weathered leather vest adorned with patches that told stories of past rides and causes, he stepped forward, scanning the crowd with a calm, measured gaze. For a moment, the square was silent. The protesters, caught off guard, stared at the newcomers, unsure of their intentions. The bikers formed a line near the barricades, their stance resolute but non-threatening. The leader raised a hand, signaling for attention. When he spoke, his voice was deep and steady, cutting through the lingering tension like a knife through butter. "We're not here to fight," he began, his tone firm but devoid of aggression. "We're here to talk." His words hung in the air, met with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. The crowd murmured among themselves, some edging closer to hear what he had to say. Others remained steadfast, their signs held high in defiance. The bikers stood their ground, their calm and disciplined demeanor a stark contrast to the emotional fervor of the protesters. Their arrival had changed the dynamic of the square, introducing a new layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. As the leader prepared to address the crowd further, the tension in the square shifted. What had started as a protest teetering on the edge of chaos now held the potential for something unexpected. A moment of reckoning, perhaps, or a chance for understanding. The next words spoken would set the tone for what was to come. The leader of the bikers, whose name tag on his vest simply read Hank, stepped forward. He removed his aviator sunglasses, revealing sharp blue eyes that scanned the crowd with both intensity and empathy. A hush fell over the protesters as his commanding presence drew their attention. "We get it," Hank began, his voice steady but powerful. "You're angry. You have every right to be. The world's a tough place, and there's a lot to be upset about. But let me tell you something. Pointing that anger at one young man isn't going to fix what's broken." His words sent a ripple through the crowd. Some protesters crossed their arms defensively, while others exchanged uncertain glances. Hank wasn't shouting or lecturing. His tone was one of understanding. "We're here because we believe in something bigger," he continued. "This country doesn't move forward by tearing each other down. It moves forward when we find ways to build each other up." Hank's words hung in the air, met with a mix of skepticism and reflection. A few protesters shouted back, their anger still raw. "Easy for you to say," yelled a woman holding a sign that read, "No justice, no peace." "I'm not saying it's easy," Hank replied, locking eyes with the woman. "Nothing about this is easy. But blaming Barron Trump for what you're mad about? That's just a distraction. He's not the one pulling the strings, and you know it." The crowd shifted uneasily. Hank's calm demeanor and undeniable logic began to plant seeds of doubt in the protesters' collective fury. "What we need is understanding," Hank added, his voice rising slightly to reach the edges of the square. "And that starts with listening to each other, not shouting each other down." Behind Hank, the other bikers stood firm, their faces a blend of solidarity and determination. The American flags they carried fluttered gently in the evening breeze, a symbol of unity rather than division. The momentary calm was broken by a young woman in the front of the crowd. Her fiery eyes and clenched fists spoke volumes about her determination. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "You think we're just mad for no reason?" she demanded, pointing a trembling finger at Hank. "You come here with your speeches and your flags, acting like you're above it all. But you're just here to protect him. You're part of the same system we're trying to tear down." Hank nodded slightly, acknowledging her frustration. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Amber," she snapped, her tone still defiant. "Well, Amber," Hank said, meeting her gaze, "I hear you. You're angry, and you've got every right to be. But tell me, how does screaming at a kid solve the problem? How does blaming him for things he hasn't done fix anything?" Amber faltered for a moment, caught off guard by his directness. He's part of the problem," she stammered, though her conviction seemed to waver. From somewhere in the middle of the crowd, an older man spoke up. His voice was weathered but firm, carrying a tone of experience. "She's right about one thing," he said, stepping closer. "The system's broken, but going after Barron won't change that." The man, dressed in a tattered denim jacket, addressed the crowd. "I've been fighting for justice longer than most of you have been alive," he said. "I've seen protests turn ugly, and I've seen people lose sight of what they were fighting for. Don't let that happen here." Amber turned toward the man, her expression conflicted. Others in the crowd began to murmur in agreement, their earlier anger giving way to reflection. Hank seized the moment. "This isn't about choosing sides," he said, his voice cutting through the growing murmur. "It's about choosing the right path. And that path doesn't start with tearing each other down. It starts with finding common ground." For the first time, the protesters seemed to hesitate. The energy in the square shifted again, the intensity of the confrontation giving way to something more contemplative. Amber stepped back, her face a mix of frustration and uncertainty. The older man placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a quiet word of encouragement. And as the bikers stood their ground, resolute but peaceful, the crowd began to consider whether their anger was truly being directed where it belonged. The uneasy calm in the square didn't last long. A young man, barely out of his teens, stepped forward from the crowd. His sharp features were twisted in defiance as he hoisted a homemade sign high above his head. The words, scrawled in angry red paint, read, "Barron Trump, guilty by association." "Why should we listen to you?" the young man shouted, directing his challenge at Hank and the bikers. "You're just here to protect another rich kid who's never faced a real problem in his life. You're standing in the way of change." Hank turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. "What's your name, son?" he asked. The young man hesitated, as if caught off guard by the question. "Tyler," he said reluctantly. "Well, Tyler," Hank began, his voice steady, "I hear you, and I know you're mad. But tell me, what's your plan? How does yelling at Barron Trump or anyone else here tonight fix what's broken?" Tyler's grip tightened on his sign. "It gets people to listen," he shot back. "If we don't make noise, nothing changes." A middle-aged biker woman, standing a few paces behind Hank, stepped forward. Her weathered face was softened by an empathetic smile. "Tyler," she said gently, "making noise is important. It gets attention. But real change? That takes more than shouting. It takes action, patience, and hope." Tyler glared at her, his defiance wavering. "Hope? What good is hope when everything is falling apart?" The woman, whose vest bore the name Marge, stepped closer. "Hope is what keeps us moving forward," she said softly. "It's what makes us believe that tomorrow can be better. And it's what gives people like you the strength to fight for something, instead of just against something." The crowd grew quieter, the raw passion of Tyler's anger meeting the quiet resolve of Marge's words. For a moment, it seemed like the tension might break. Tyler's grip on his sign slackened. His shoulders dropped slightly as Marge's words seemed to reach him. "So what are we supposed to do?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. "Just stand here and wait for someone else to fix it?" "No," Marge said, shaking her head. "You take that anger and turn it into something constructive. Find ways to make a difference, real difference, in your community. Work with people, not against them. That's how you build something that lasts." Tyler hesitated, lowering his sign. Around him, others in the crowd began to shift uneasily. Some protesters, inspired by the exchange, started to reconsider their own actions. Signs that had been held high with anger now drooped, and a few were even placed on the ground. "I didn't come here tonight to fight," an older woman in the crowd said, stepping forward. "I came because I'm tired of being ignored. But maybe we're going about this the wrong way." Marge nodded at her. "And maybe tonight's the start of something better," she said. The bikers, who had formed a quiet, steady line near the barricades, continued to exude calm and resolve. Their presence was no longer seen as a threat, but as a reminder of unity in the face of division. In the midst of this shifting atmosphere, a ripple of movement caught everyone's attention. Heads turned toward the hotel as the double doors opened, and Barron Trump stepped out. Dressed in his simple suit, Barron walked slowly toward the barricades, his expression calm and composed despite the charged atmosphere. His sudden appearance sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. Some protesters looked uncertain, while others tensed, unsure of what to expect. As he approached the edge of the police line, Barron raised a hand. Not in defiance, but in a gesture of peace. The square, which had been filled with shouting and chaos just moments before, now held its breath. Whatever happened next would determine the course of the night. Barron Trump paused just a few feet from the barricades, his tall frame backlit by the warm glow of the hotel lights. His face showed no trace of fear, only a calm determination that belied his young age. He scanned the crowd, his gaze meeting the eyes of protesters who had once shouted angrily at him. "I know why you're here," Barron began, his voice steady but not loud. The crowd quieted further, straining to hear him. "You're angry, you're frustrated, and you feel like no one is listening. I understand that." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but no one interrupted. Barron's measured tone and earnest expression held their attention. "I'm not here tonight to talk politics," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "I'm here because I believe in helping people. That's why I'm attending this event. It's for a charity that supports underprivileged kids, kids who don't have the resources, the opportunities, or the support that they deserve." His words gave the crowd pause. The image of him as a detached, privileged figure began to shift, replaced by something more human. "I'm not the enemy," Barron said, his voice softening, "and neither are you. We all want the same thing, a better future. But that future doesn't come from fighting each other. It comes from understanding each other." At the back of the crowd, Amber stood with her arms crossed, her earlier anger now tempered with confusion. She glanced at Tyler, who was still holding his sign but now staring at Barron with visible uncertainty. Barron took a deep breath and continued. If you're here to make a difference, then do it. Focus on what matters, helping those who need it most. That's what I'm trying to do. And I think we can all agree that helping people is more important than fighting. The square fell silent. For the first time that evening, the atmosphere was no longer charged with hostility. It was filled with something more tentative, reflection. Barron's words lingered in the air, their impact spreading slowly through the crowd. Protesters who had been shouting earlier now stood motionless, their signs drooping in their hands. Even Tyler, who had been one of the loudest voices of dissent, found himself lowering his sign completely, his eyes fixed on the young man standing before them. Hank, standing a few paces behind the barricades, nodded approvingly. The bikers, still forming a silent line near the police, remained vigilant but at ease, sensing the shift in energy. A middle-aged man in the crowd stepped forward hesitantly. His weathered face showed years of hard work and quiet struggle. "You really believe that?" he asked, his voice skeptical but not unkind. "You really think we can fix things without fighting?" Barron turned to him, his expression sincere. "I do," he replied, "because I've seen what happens when people come together for a common cause. It doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean we won't disagree. But if we spend all our time tearing each other apart, we'll never have the strength to build something better." The man nodded slowly, his skepticism fading into thoughtful consideration. Others in the crowd began to murmur among themselves, their anger replaced by a quieter sense of purpose. Amber, still watching from the sidelines, felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected to feel anything other than rage tonight, but Barron's words had pierced through her defenses. She glanced at Marge, who was now smiling gently at her. "You see," Marge said softly, "sometimes it's not about being right or wrong. It's about finding a way forward." Amber hesitated, her grip on her sign slackening. Slowly, she let it fall to her side. Around her, other protesters were doing the same, their signs resting against their legs or being placed carefully on the ground. The square, once filled with chants of anger, was now silent except for the faint hum of the city in the background. Barron looked around, his expression a mix of relief and quiet pride. "We don't have to agree on everything," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "But if we can agree to listen to each other, that's a good place to start." A fragile peace began to take hold. The bikers stood as a steady presence, their role shifting from protectors to silent witnesses of a moment of understanding. For the first time that evening, the possibility of unity felt within reach. As Barron stepped back toward the hotel, the crowd remained still, processing his words. The energy in the square had shifted from anger to something softer, uncertainty mixed with hope. The protesters, many of whom had arrived fueled by frustration and a sense of injustice, now found themselves grappling with unexpected emotions. Tyler, who had been among the most vocal earlier, let out a slow breath. His sign, once held high with determination, now rested limply at his side. "Maybe he's right," he murmured, barely loud enough for Amber to hear. Amber glanced at him, her expression conflicted. "It's not that simple," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. From the back of the crowd, the older man who had spoken up earlier moved forward. His worn denim jacket caught the light as he addressed the group. "It's never simple," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But fighting the wrong battles only makes things harder. Maybe it's time we think about what we're really here to accomplish." Around him, protesters began nodding. Some started to lower their signs completely, while others folded them and tucked them under their arms. A sense of calm began to spread, replacing the tension that had dominated the square just minutes before. The bikers remained steady in their positions, their presence now less of a barrier and more of a symbol of quiet solidarity. Marge, standing near Hank, leaned in and spoke softly. "Looks like things are starting to cool down." Hank nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. "For now," he replied, "but it's fragile. Could go either way if someone stirs the pot." The police, who had been standing at the ready, also began to relax. Officers loosened their grips on their batons and exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the unexpected turn of events. Barron turned one last time to face the crowd, offering a small nod of gratitude. The gesture was met with a mix of responses. Some protesters looked away, unwilling to fully embrace the peace, while others gave tentative nods in return. As he disappeared back into the hotel, the square began to shift. Protesters and bikers, who had been divided moments earlier, started engaging in quiet conversations. A few protesters approached the bikers cautiously, asking questions or simply expressing their thoughts. The bikers, in turn, listened without judgment, their presence reinforcing the possibility of understanding over conflict. As the night wore on, the once chaotic square settled into an unexpected harmony. Protesters who had arrived with fiery anger now stood in small groups, talking among themselves or with the bikers. The tension that had crackled in the air earlier was gone, replaced by a tentative sense of reflection. Amber, still holding her sign, approached Marge. "You really think any of this will matter tomorrow?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Marge smiled warmly. "I think every step toward understanding matters," she said, "even if it's small. Change doesn't happen overnight, but nights like this, they're where it starts." Amber looked down at her sign, then back at Marge. Slowly, she set it on the ground and stepped away, her expression a mix of relief and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Tyler found himself in a conversation with Hank. "I didn't come here expecting to listen to anyone," Tyler admitted, his voice low. "But maybe you're right. Maybe shouting doesn't get us anywhere." Hank clapped a hand on Tyler's shoulder. "It takes guts to admit that," he said. "Now take that energy and do something good with it. That's how you really make a difference." As the crowd thinned, the bikers began to mount their motorcycles. The rumble of engines filled the square, but this time, it wasn't met with hostility. Instead, the sound seemed to carry a sense of closure. One by one, the bikers rode off, their American flags fluttering in the night breeze. The protesters, too, began to disperse, some walking away in pairs or small groups, deep in conversation. By the time the square emptied, it was almost unrecognizable from the scene earlier that evening. The signs and slogans that had once defined the protest were replaced by a lingering sense of introspection. For those who had been there, the night left an impression that wouldn't easily fade. It wasn't just about Barron Trump or the bikers. It was about the possibility of finding common ground in a world that so often seemed divided. And as the city settled into the quiet of the night, the square stood as a testament to what could happen when people chose dialogue over conflict, unity over division. As the last of the bikers disappeared into the distance, and the streets of Charleston returned to their quiet rhythm, the square remained bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. The echoes of heated chants and anger had faded, replaced by a stillness that carried a sense of possibility. For the protesters who had gathered that evening, it wasn't just about the causes they had fought for or the issues they had voiced. It was about realizing that change didn't have to come from confrontation. It could begin with understanding, with the willingness to listen, and with the courage to see one another not as adversaries, but as fellow human beings. Barron Trump's words had pierced through the noise, challenging not just the crowd, but also himself to see beyond the labels. And for many, it had been a moment of reflection, an invitation to rethink their own approach to making a difference. The bikers, too, had shown that sometimes the most unlikely of allies could stand together to create a space for peace, and that a single act of reaching out could have a ripple effect far beyond what anyone could anticipate. The night had been a testament to the power of words, simple, honest words that sought unity over division, dialogue over discord. It was a reminder that even in the most volatile of times, moments of grace could emerge, changing the course of a story that had seemed headed for conflict. In the end, the protest had been more than a demonstration. It had been a turning point. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be filled with challenges, the night had shown that no matter how deep the divisions seemed, there was always room for a new beginning. A beginning where understanding, compassion, and hope could light the way forward. As the city slept, the memory of that evening lingered. A small, yet powerful reminder that peace could emerge even in the most unexpected of places. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. and watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it and that the message behind the story resonated with you. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with others so they can enjoy it too. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories or new videos. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next video.